And the north is not exempt from this heat dome. Environment Canada issued a warning for 7 communities in Northwest Territories. Temperatures in Fort Smith are expected to rise to 30 degrees this weekend. But it isn't just the heat that's a problem. Chris Westwell is the acting mayor of Fort Smith, and he joins us now. So, Mayor, tell us how these extremes and climate change are affecting your community.
Good evening. Thanks for having me. Or good afternoon. Our community has it's kind of the classic boiling pot scenario where we've year over year. I feel like the trend is getting drier. One of the things we've been noticing and taken note of by numerous Indigenous governments as well as local governments has been water levels on our river. As our water levels seem to be getting lower and lower on our river due to a combination of industrial activity and change in weather patterns, our water level gets lower, our riverbank becomes less stable. The water pressure in the system itself that actually helps keep the shore, which is largely sand, sort of stable. And as the water level lowers and it dries, the material becomes much less stable. And then when water levels rise back up again due to either increased rainfall or again industrial activity or dams upriver in British Columbia, those looser soils get washed away. So what we're experiencing actually is seems to be an increased loss of riverbank in our community. It's not climate change has been affecting a lot of communities when it comes to how water is eroding due to permafrost loss. In ours, it's an interesting scenario where it's actually the bank stability is being lost due to the ever seemingly more regular low water levels.
And so what are you doing to decrease the chances of a landslide occurring and to stabilize that riverbank?
So the riverbank stability has been an ongoing concern in Fort Smith. We have historically had a landslide, which there was a loss of life back in the 60s, and is close to a lot of people to this day. We have a whole area of non-development, what we call the slide zone, that is sort of a buffer between the riverbank and here, what is mostly sort of a preemptive or just in case. But what they did is they actually went in and sloped the area of the original landslide. And so they sloped it down to a certain degree where itself, that area is no longer sloping. But that's where the landslide occurred. And what we're actually seeing now is a lot of sloping and sliding in other areas that weren't leveled down, where they haven't gone in and actually lowered the angle of the banks to stop the slumping and erosion. So what's actually needed is to get in there and get some engineering analysis done, and then start actually going in and removing, moving the earth to reduce the angle and try to reduce the sloping. Now, I mean, the Slave River is a powerful river, and certainly when the water is high, and it does get high seasonally, but even when it's low, it can be a very powerful river. So there's only so much river mitigation you can do, but what we're seeing is actually almost strictly sloping and landslide due to low water levels and or human activity. But so what we're hoping to do is go in and slope the land, and then if additional necessary measures are taken, whether it's berms, rocks, or other sort of areas where we can sort of address to keep the water levels from eroding the sand further. But predominantly what they did in, I believe it was the late 70s when they sloped the land here has been functional. It has actually stopped the slumping and the continued slides by just bringing the ground down to a certain grade.
And so, you know, I know the heat isn't the big story, but 31 degrees to a lot of people who live in the south sounds pretty hot for Northwest Territories. That's hot, isn't it?
It certainly is. It's not. One of the interesting things is like many things in the north that is a mystery to people in the south, is that we actually wildly fluctuate from minus 36 in the winter to plus 33 in the summer. So we're not new to hot weather. Mm-hmm. Almost every year we have bouts of hot weather. We reach the 30s pretty regularly in July and sometimes in June. This year we actually hit 30 in May, and then we actually had a pretty cool June, and then July has basically come, and as everybody in town seems to be saying, is that summer is finally here. That said, it went from being fairly cool to being quite hot rather quickly. So I think what's changed has been the sort of earlier season. It's hotter and drier faster in the spring, which is causing a lot of melt off before the ground and the trees have had a chance to green up. And so the wildfire risk in May has seemingly become a higher and higher risk, as most of our major wildfires in northern Alberta, northern Saskatchewan, and in the Northwest Territories in the boreal forest seem to be taking place more and more often in the spring. Certainly with McMurray and Slave Lake both happening in May, and even high levels fires beginning in May in that vicinity. So what's one of the biggest things I think we've noticed here is not necessarily peak temperature, but average high temperature in the early spring, and maybe some longer heat wave bouts throughout the summer. We've certainly had some, I think, record-breaking bouts of periodic warmth over the last few years. So it's that whole slow boiling pot versus hot boiling pot, right? It seems you kind of have to look back and look at the picture over the 20 years to really see that things are averaging more extreme in a sense than they are even season over season. Some summers are quite wet still.
Appreciate you taking the time. Thank you very much.
Hey, no problem at all. Thank you very much.
That was Chris Westwell, the acting mayor of Fort Smith, Northwest Territories.